Hi, my name is Yannic. I work at EngFlow, and today we are going to talk a bit how to secure builds with Credential Helpers and why that is necessary. So let's start with a quick overview of what we are going to do today. We will start with an introduction about what authentication story looks like. Then we will do a bit of a deep dive into Bazel and how it looks like in Bazel. Then we are going to introduce you to the Credential Helper in Bazel and how you can use that. Then we are going to do a quick demo, which I hope the internet gods here at Iceland are going to be better than the weather gods, I guess. Then we are going to conclude the talk. All right, so let's start. So what makes a build secure? Well, there's the things that we talk about all the time, like reproducible and hermetic. But with modern build systems like Bazel, like Buck2, like Reclient, like Antonio's nice Webpack prototype thingy, they often also interact with remote systems. So that's why they also need to interact with this. That is part of the security story of the build system, right? So today we are going to focus mostly on this in this talk. I think we already talked a bit about reproducible and hermeticity in the other talks so far, and we might do in the remaining talk. I'm not sure. But yeah, we talk about reproducible and hermeticity all the time. Let's look a bit of the status quo of authentication. And I'm going to use Bazel as an example here because it turns out that's what I know best if you look at my chart. So Bazel, until about a year ago, has supported a few built-in authentication mechanisms for TCP IAM because Google needed that. They support NetRC, they support MTLS, which I think was contributed by us at some point. There's a bunch more. And Bazel actually frequently gets requests for more authentication mechanisms. I remember getting AWS S3 popping up there a couple of times because people wanted to use S3 as a remote cache. I think I've also seen Azure. I've seen someone wanting to integrate Git authentication into Bazel. And I'm sure there's more. But not all other authentication mechanisms actually do apply to all remote services. As you might know, Bazel has this build event service. And Bazel claims to have NetRC support. Until a year ago, that just didn't work because it wasn't hooked up, because nobody bothered to do it. Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed story there, right? Or it was. So then, with the rise of a lot of remote execution and other remote service vendors, a lot of times they work around these limitations by telling people to use the BES remote header flags or the friends. There's actually like 5 of them, if you look clearly enough. However, that requires to store the credentials in plain text, typically in the Bazel RC file, which is possible but not desirable from a security perspective. And especially if you're using BES and some remote services to look at your UI, it turns out they often show the flags and they leak credentials. So in our case, this is a bit what this looks like. You can see there's the BES header and the remote header flags with the authentication token that we now actually do redact away. But I can tell you we didn't do that in the beginning. And it's right now it only redacts away the actual token, but there might be arbitrarily many remote execution flags, and it's basically impossible to show this without basically redacting all of them, which we don't do. So then about a year ago, we created the Credential Helper for Bazel, which delegates handling of credentials to an external process that Bazel then just calls whenever it does a gRPC call or whenever it does a remote repository download as part of workspace evaluation. It's available since Bazel 7.0, which the first release candidate was cut just a few days ago. So hopefully that will be available soon. It's experimental. It is in 6.0, and we fixed a bunch of bugs in the 6.x releases. So you can already use it in 6.x. And there are some preliminary plans to replace even the existing authentication mechanisms like .NET RC parsing with built-in or external credential helpers, because that functionality really doesn't need to be inside Bazel directly. We did a talk, I did a joint talk with Tiago from Google last year at the Build Meetup in New York, if you're interested. There's a YouTube recording of it. But now that we have credential helpers in Bazel, wouldn't it be nice that we wouldn't it be nice if we had them beyond Bazel as well? An increasingly large number of remote execution systems can talk to remote of build systems can talk to remote execution API. We heard a lot about Buck2. Today we are going to hear about Reclient. There's the CMake Goma system. There is Webpack. Thank you. So why not bring the Bazel's Credential Helper to these as well? And we thought, yeah, let's do that. Now, the original implementation was based on a proposal in Bazel that was spec'd out, not really in much detail, and left a lot of questions. So in the past year, and especially in the past couple of weeks and months, we've compiled this into a more formal specification that actually handles a lot of the corner cases that we discovered while implementing in Bazel. It is based on the reference implementation in Bazel, and this will allow other build systems to also adopt credential helpers. I can tell you that Antonio's, sorry for going back to this, Antonio's prototype for Webpack actually already uses credential helpers under Dirt. And it also allows community-driven improvement of the specification, right? There's lots of open questions how to handle caching, which Bazel just has a flag. But a lot of times the credentials, like the tool, the credential helper knows how when the credentials expire. So in theory, the protocol should tell Bazel, hey, cache this for 1 hour and this other one for just for 5 minutes or whatever. And you know, now that we have a spec, we have a way to improve the specification and make all of these things happen. So now it's demo time. So I really hope this works. And we are actually going to do this not on Bazel, we are going to do this on Buck2, which we have created a prototype for credential helpers. I hope you can all read this. It might be a bit small from the back. So I've configured the Buck project that is actually part of the Buck repository that demonstrates remote execution to use the credential helper, and just pointed to one of our development remote execution systems. I also tweaked things a bit to make it work on my Mac, because it wants to run on Linux by default and it didn't work. So let me make sure it's clean. It is clean, and just do the build. And that is invoking the credential helper under Dot to get credentials. There is no credentials statically configured in this file. If you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think by default it's configured also just as a Bazel in this text file. And it just works. I think the default one just doesn't want to do caching because it does some random actions, so that's why we don't get caches. But in theory, you would get cached, and you can see this runs a couple of actions on remote execution. So let's jump back to the slides. Now you've seen we have a prototype of this in Buck. We are planning to send this upstream, and I hope the Buck people are going to accept that. We are also working with Google to get it into our client. I know you already have it. So the conclusion is credential helpers can provide a very secure way to inject credentials into a build. In our case, of this credential helper that I was using, this is actually using the native keychain on macOS with Docker credentials. So they're not in a plain text file, but that is outside of the talk. Let's go for the talk. And we hope that the open specification will allow adoption beyond Bazel, because having it in the Bazel proposal with like 2 sentences and lots of open questions is not ideal. Okay, time for questions.
Do you handle the secret management on the worker side, or is it purely client side?
No, this is purely client side. This is for connecting to the remote execution system. But in theory, you could use that to get secrets into a worker as well with the protocol. Any other questions?
Does it support MTLS?
No. But you can send a pull request against certification. All right, if there's no further questions, then thank you. If you want to connect to me, here are some links.
Thanks very much, Yannic.